Hello everybody, it's Sarah and today I am here again with Top 5 Wednesday. This week's topic is our top 5 underrated books from our favorite genre. And honestly, I thought I wouldn't be able to upload a video because my favorite genre, as everyone knows, is fantasy, and I thought that there had previously been a topic that was our top 5 favorite underrated fantasy books. But I couldn't find one on my channel, so I thought I probably haven't talked about this before, even though I have talked loads and loads about all the books that are going to be on this list, but you can just listen to that once again, and so let me get into it. Since fantasy is quite broad, I decided to narrow it down to high fantasy, mostly adult high fantasy, because that's just what I'm mostly reading, but I have one exception, and that exception is The Gospel of Loki by Joanne M. Harris. This, as the title suggests, is a retelling of Nordic mythology, but all from the point of view of Loki, and it's quirky and it's funny and it's adventurous and action-packed, and I absolutely love it. It's not high literature, but it doesn't attempt to be. And so I really think it's underrated and everyone should go read it and laugh as much as I did. The next book is actually not that underrated, at least I don't think, in the community of people who read a lot of high fantasy. I think quite a few people who regularly read high fantasy have read this book. However, I have hardly ever watched a booktuber who has read this book. Most of the people who have read the book are people that I have talked to in my personal life. So maybe it's just a book that's more known in the Austrian high fantasy community. But that book is The Black Magician's Trilogy. It's the same every time I talk about that book. I cannot remember what the trilogy's name is, but it's by Trudy Canavan, and the first book is called The Magician's Guild. This story is an adult high fantasy story, and it follows a girl named Sonea who grew up in the slums of her city. And in the city there's a pretty famous magician's guild. However, only aristocrats are admitted into that guild to be taught how to use magic. Part of the reason is because you have to have an inherent potential to use magic to be taught magic. And it is believed that only aristocrats have this potential, which of course is rooted in classicism, so it's like a classic story in that way. But one day it's discovered that Sonea is actually quite a powerful magician, and if she's not taught to use magic, she could potentially kill herself and take quite a few people with her into death. And so it's the story of those pretentious magicians trying to get her to join her in their guild and all the obstacles she faces. I absolutely loved this story. It was one of the first high fantasy novels that I've ever read. I think I mentioned it in my list of gateway books into high fantasy, and so I definitely recommend you read it if you have not yet. And I think even if I know quite a few people who have read it, who read a lot of high fantasy, I still think that this book is incredibly underrated just in the general reading population. Next, I have another book that I have talked about a lot, and this is a book that, as far as I have seen, is actually getting more attention, at least among smaller booktubers, and that is the Hydron Chronicles by Jennifer Fallon. The first book is Wolfblade, and then in extension to the Hydron Chronicles, also the Demon Child trilogy, although I prefer the Hydron Chronicles. Both the Hydron Chronicles and the Demon Child trilogy are set in the same kind of world, same universe. Both are, again, adult high fantasy. Actually, this high fantasy book I have also mentioned in my gateway books to high fantasy because it's quite similar to a Game of Thrones, but less complicated and with less characters, although there's still extensive world building and a lot of characters. This in particular follows Marla, who is a young girl who is the sister of the High Prince, I think it's called, but it's like the quasi-king of that country, and it's just her navigating court intrigues and arranged marriages and assassination attempts and all that fun stuff. It's a really good book. I love the characters, and you should all go read it because it's really underrated. Although, in my opinion, most high fantasy that is not like Brandon Sanderson, Patrick Rothfuss, or YA high fantasy is really underrated, because for some reason people are just afraid to read it, which, okay, it's not totally bullshit, because they are often difficult to get into, but I think a lot of people could get into it quite easily if you just gave it a chance. Next, I have a book that is underrated simply because it was not written originally in English, and apparently, like, unless you have huge authors like Cornelia Funke, it's just not interesting to publish books that aren't originally written in English, even if they were translated. And again, I have talked about this book as well, and that is Nihal from the Land of the Wind. Again, I forgot what the original title of the trilogy is, but that is the title of the first book. The whole trilogy is written by Licia Troisi, although I probably butchered the name since she is originally Italian. I read the book in German. I thought the translation into German was quite good, but again, I can't say anything about the English translation, and maybe that's why it's so underrated. Maybe the English translation is absolutely horrible, but it's still an amazing book. It follows the story of Nihal, who is the last survivor of her race. And when she finds out, she wants to join the Dragon Knights or Dragon Riders. I don't know how they translated it into English. The problem is they never before accepted a female Dragon Rider, so it's not quite easy for her. This for once is not adult high fantasy, it is young adult. But it's still amazing to read. I still highly enjoy reading it. I actually think I have a whole spoiler-free review of the whole trilogy, so I will leave that down below if you're interested in checking it out a bit more. And yeah, go ahead and read it. So anyone want to take a guess what my #1 adult high fantasy book is? Huh? Is anyone wondering that it's the Black Jules trilogy by Anne Bishop? Probably not. I have raved about this book again and again and again on my channel, and I will not stop raving until everyone at least thought about reading this book. I kind of understand why it's underrated, because this is not exactly a story that is mass friendly. There are a lot of trigger warnings for this story, especially for rape, abuse, child abuse, pedophilia, especially in the first book. So if those are trigger warnings for you, if you feel very uncomfortable reading about that kind of stuff, I would not recommend this book, honestly. But even though it deals with so many hard topics, I feel it's really well and thoughtful done. This is a high fantasy book that actually has a lot of social criticism kind of hidden in it, and I am not going to attempt to summarize this book because it's way too complicated for that. At the core, it's a bit of a chosen one storyline where you have this girl who is supposed to save the world. So if you're even just a little bit intrigued by this story, if you love high fantasy where it's not just a lot of action, actually there's not that much action in this book, but where it's mostly based on social interactions, then I think you will definitely love this book, and you should all go ahead and read it because it deserves so much more than it gets. So that was it for my top 5 underrated fantasy books. Tell me if you have read any of those, if you also think that these books are underrated and deserve so much more love. Tell me about your underrated high fantasy books, because I am currently really searching again for good high fantasy books to read, and I'm kind of a bit tired of just reading the high fantasy books everyone else has already read, and I want to get away from the mainstream booktube reading again and want to delve a bit more into books that not a lot of people have read. So it Doesn't even just have to be high fantasy. You can just put any books that you love down there and that you think I might enjoy too. All the links to my social media will be in the description box down below, and all the links and info for Top 5 Wednesday as well. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and also maybe subscribe, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!